A very warm good morning to everybody. My name is Sonia Reines Chivenides. I'm the Executive Director of the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office, and the great pleasure of being the moderator of this very interesting panel today. I'm thrilled to introduce a very fascinating panorama, but before I do, let me go over what the title of this session is. It's called Power, Resources and Participation, Addressing Inequalities for Sustainable Peace, Ensuring Access to Resources, Decision-Making and Participation for Peace and Development. And while the title of the panel is quite long, it does reflect the breadth of the issue. As we see across the globe, from Europe to almost every corner of the planet, inequalities are wreaking havoc on world peace. The range of issues that we will address today are inextricably linked, and we have to stretch our minds, our imagination of what is possible, and ultimately our actions to find solutions to these multifaceted issues. What we're going to be looking at starts from what does it really take for a country to cycle out of conflict? What does it take to form a contemporary functioning social contract? What are we learning from local communities? How are we engaging with them? What kind of support do they need? Looking at a country like South Africa that has come so far, how are you addressing inequalities in your country? How are you innovating to meet the challenges? And looking closer at home to Europe, as the issues are global, looking at SDGs and social inclusion issues here. I have a few housekeeping items for you. I've been asked to let you know to use your headsets to avoid being too noisy for the other rooms, and also to help with our interpretation sign language. For those of you who are all multitasking, I see lots of cell phones out there, tweet, tweet, tweet. Use the Twitter hashtag, because we're not only having the conversation amongst ourselves, we're supposed to be reaching people that are outside of this room. So we have hashtag Think Twice, hashtag EDD19, hashtag Sustainable Peace, and any others that you care to invent throughout the session. Let me briefly introduce the speakers. I could tell you it would take about an hour to introduce their full bios. I'm going to give you the short version. Christian Leffler, really a pleasure to have you here. Deputy Secretary General of the EAS for Economic and Global Issues. So you really oversee the EU's external relations on cross-cutting issues, including the 2030 Agenda, EU trade and development cooperation, migration, governance, human rights, environment, climate change, and energy, and anything else. And you've had experience really working across the globe in your career so far. Thank you very much. Yasmin Uran is the young leader for this panel. Young European of the Year for 2019. Congratulations. She's an advocate for social and gender justice in Europe. She's an expert on peace and security at the EU-AU Youth Cooperation Hub, and an award-winning fellow at Women Deliver. And I'm sure I've missed other awards and those to come, but again, thank you very much. Glenn Mashinini, thank you also, the chairperson of the Electoral Commission of South Africa. You're overseeing the management of the elections in South Africa, no small feat. And you're also a special projects advisor to the President of the Republic of South Africa, and very globally known for your expertise and assistance and advisory of elections across the African continent. Ulrika Moder, far to my right, Assistant Secretary General of the UNDP, leading on external relations, on communications, on advocacy. Previous to that, as State Secretary for Sweden for International Development Cooperation and Climate Change, and really a very impressive career so far in reshaping organizations and policies to support the achievements of the 2030 Agenda. And Ricardo Fuentes Nieves is Oxfam Mexico's Executive Director, leading the multifaceted programs across Mexico, which I'll just name a few: inclusive economies, the prevention of land-related conflicts and access to natural resources, prevention of violence against women and girls. And you've really been outspoken as a researcher and author and thinker trying to shape the debate on inequality. So we're going to cross the globe, we're going to cover various different components of this debate, and then we also know there's a lot of expertise in the room. So I've been very cruel. I've asked my speakers to only speak for 5 minutes, which is near impossible, to give you some sound bites. There'll be a few follow-up questions, and then we'll go out to the floor and make this as interactive as we possibly can. So shall we get started? Christian, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks not for inviting me, but tolerating me. I offer double apologies. Firstly, from my boss, Helga Schmidt, who unfortunately cannot be here for this panel because she's had to go off on an urgent mission abroad. And secondly, because while I'm very happy to replace her, I can't stay until the end, so I will have to leave a little early. My apologies for that. Now, on this subject, I think, firstly, your introduction of the panel is a very good illustration of the importance of a holistic approach to the issues we're addressing in order to promote sustainable peace, stability and development. The important place of women and youth in order to take this forward. The governance issues that we have present here as well, and the active role of civil society. Humbly, I would also add that it's not bad to have a few public civil servants along as well to mobilize the administration. All of this to say we need to find a many-pronged approach to addressing the underlying causes of conflict and to be able to either prevent conflict, overcome it, mitigate it, depending on the circumstances we are in, and then build a sustainable approach to future. I did earlier this morning a panel on climate change. Climate change as an exacerbator, a driver of conflict, a driver of inequality. I think this is something we need to keep in mind. That's certainly one of the big underlying causes and puts us in the context of the SDGs and how we need to take an overarching approach. But a driver, I said, of conflict and of inequality, and I think the inequality aspect is fundamental to the theme we're discussing here. It is crucial to find ways of addressing inequalities and working on inclusion in order to create the circumstances for sustainable peace and stability. We've tried to develop different ways of doing that from the side of the European Union, and inclusion is not just socio-economic. That's an important aspect. But political inclusion is just as important, to make people feel that they are fully part of a society, that they can help shaping the future of their society, depending on where we are in the world, and that's probably politically incorrect to say, but ethnic inclusion is also an important dimension, to ensure that it is society as a whole and all members of that society, whatever their background, whether they are newcomers or long-timers, whether they are minority, majority, whatever, they all find their place in those societies. So looking at those, looking at the hard facts, if you like, climate, the issues of access to land, to water, to food, plus the sort of softer tissue in terms of how society is made up and how we can work on the inclusion side. I'm aware I'm probably already running out of time, but just a couple of quick examples to illustrate some of this. One, in terms of the holistic approach, what we're trying to do in the Sahel from the side of the European Union to work with our partner countries in the Sahel. How you need to look at participation and inclusion, how you need to look at the fight against climate change and the displacement that it provokes, the conflict over resources that it provokes, how therefore you need to develop a vision that looks at the governance, looks at the concrete situation, the physical situation of people, and look at the factors of the expectations and outlook. That means there's a strong diplomatic dimension, there's a strong development dimension in a very classic development sense. As an indication, in the last 5 years, the EU and member states have mobilized around about 8 billion euro in support of the countries in the Sahel in order to address both the immediate challenges but also the long-term trends and the underlying root causes. The final one there, particularly in the Sahel, sadly for the moment, is on security and defense, to try to stabilize the countries in the face of strong destabilizing movements of which, whatever their origin, have had a radicalizing effect on society and weakens the political and social tissue. Second, how do we work on this? We've tried to develop what we call an early warning system, where we have a regular horizon scanning to look at a number of indicators. What is it that might undermine the cohesion and stability of different societies? And how can we come in early to try to work with the authorities or the other actors, civil society and others, to address those factors that, if they're left alone, might lead to a weakening of the resilience of those countries. Third one, the importance of including women. We've done a lot of work, notably in the situation where we've had a global collective failure to address conflict, Syria, to see how can we bring Syrian women into the various attempts at establishing a dialogue that can lead to peace. We've done it in different ways. We've brought a lot of women together from inside Syria, from outside Syria. We've created what we call the Gaziantep Women's Platform to bridge the divide between different groups of Syrian society, those who disagree on many things, but in order to make sure that they can start formulating a vision for the future of Syria, and that they can influence and participate in the negotiating work as and when it can really get going. And that's because we are convinced, and I'll stop with that, there's a lot of talk about the women as victims in conflict, women and children as victims. They are, and they're often more exposed than others, but they're also actors and agents for peace and change. And as a middle-aged man, I can say that women and youth are probably usually more ambitious, more critical, and more pragmatic than we are. So we certainly need to have them fully on board to make progress towards sustainable peace and stability.
Christian, thank you very much. I think you've given us quite a bit to chew on. I'm not going to summarize, and we're going to get back to you on a few of those points. Yasmin, over to you.
Thank you. I will speak as a young leader from Europe, the only one for this year. And across Europe, migration has become the winning and losing topic of elections. It has become an anchor issue, showing a clear split of opinion within our societies. But the real issue behind the cycles of poverty and violence are inequalities. I witnessed through my work with marginalized community of France different forms of exclusion and discrimination that can ultimately lead to violence. Since 2015, I witnessed in my country the perpetrate of some of the most horrible forms of violent extremism by young people. And these perpetrators often come from the same underprivileged socioeconomic society and poverty backgrounds. They often have followed the same path: poverty, exclusion, often lack of education, leading to criminality, then prison, and ultimately radicalization. The same phenomenon can be seen both in Europe, in Africa, and beyond. When we live in societies that are profoundly divided in opportunities, in wealth, in access to services and jobs, health, education, when your name, your origin, and your social background, your neighborhood, they define your future, then it is to no surprise that we must talk about power, participation, and resources. If we want to solve this issue, we need to give access to equal opportunity to youth in underprivileged areas of Europe. How? Formal education may not be the adequate solution to the needs of these youth. We need to promote vocational training and non-formal education, and we have an amazing tool, which is the Erasmus program, that I could benefit from, and that I really sustain. And then urban planification. We need to make our society more diverse, even geographically. And social inclusion by addressing the systemic discrimination towards minorities. And in order to do this, we need to involve the right people at the discussion table. We have the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2250, adopted in 2015, which was a groundbreaking because for the first time, it called for effective participation of young people in peace-building efforts in fragile areas. And then we have the 1419 United Nations Security Council resolution adopted in 2018, last year, that reaffirms its commitment for youth engagement in peace processes and calls on regional and sub-regional bodies to implement it. So we need to ensure that youth are not only heard, but effectively involved in the design of programs. An example of working with youth is the AU-EU Youth Hub that I'm part of. It's a successful example of the youth of two continents, Africa and Europe, coming together and voicing their concerns through a youth-led process. It began in 2017 from several youth networks as a document, and then, which was the Abidjan Youth Declaration. And then it was translated into action by the institution, the European Union and the African Union, that created the hub. Today, as 42 young experts, we collaborate with these two institutions to design 6 pilot projects that were published in a call for proposal that is available online. I invite you to have a look on it, that will be implemented by the civil society organization with a budget of 10 million euros. For our project on peace and security, we'll focus on the Lake Chad Basin region, which is a very fragile area. And the fact that 2 of my colleagues come precisely from that region has been an added value in terms of understanding the needs and fragility. My colleague, Imran Abuba, survived from attacks from Boko Haram in Nigeria, and today he trains thousands of young people in peace building. But those youth are not only involved in drafting the project, we are also involved in the monitoring and implementation, and the local youth will be also involved in documenting the existing basic services, which gives to our project ownership and helps to enhance transparency, accountability, and integrity on ground. So all this is crucial because the representation of youth and women in peace processes remains undervalued in conflicts around the world. Since 2005, we have the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which has been a framework for inclusion of women in peace processes. But its implementation is far from being reached. For example, in the Palermo Summit on Libya, no women from Libya, no Libyan women were initially invited. And the activist, my colleague, Hajar Sharif, has been advocating for women inclusion in this precise summit through the campaign, "You Are Missing the Bigger Picture." And they managed to get women involved in the very last minute. And so tokenization is not representation, but we mean a meaningful engagement. We need to foster this meaningful engagement because tokenization of women and youth will not ultimately lead to an inclusive process. So we need to write policies. We need to make sure that the first concerns are on the table while we write these policies, and only then we will be able to talk about building sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. I think you've given a couple of very concrete examples about what it means to actually engage with youth, not just sort of written in or tokenized, but what it really means to engage from the outset. Thank you for that, and of course we'll come back. Glenn, please.
Thank you. Well, I think for me, looking at this topic, really, one wants just to share a good story. It's the story of the EU, an organization called ECAS, coming together in partnership with us as the Electoral Management Commission of South Africa 12 months ago, and we pegged our position on the ground, and 12 months later we were announcing the resounding peaceful elections in South Africa that took place in May. That success story is an indication that it is possible to make a humble contribution in peace building, because peace is a precondition to development, to addressing inequalities in this world, and to creating a world that is relatively just. So what did we do? We focus on conflict resolution and dispute resolutions. That particular project trained throughout the country almost 1,000 people that came from all walks of life. And they were trained and redeployed across the country in the various districts, so that they can be now your frontline team of people to diffuse the disputes when they're still incipient, or even when they became latent, or finally if they became manifest. And the results that we would like to share is that following our elections that took place on the 8th of May, the experts on peace, for example, Mary DeHaans, pronounced quite clearly that those particular elections in South Africa were free and fair. But since 1994 elections, these were the most peaceful elections in the history of the country. And part of the reason was us coming out of our ivory towers as bureaucrats and technocrats and putting down our ties and making sure that the people on the ground are actually empowered to take ownership for peaceful, sustainable elections in their communities. I had people, some of them retired magistrates, and coming up and saying, we don't have much to do. We're so grateful that at least we found this kind of a platform to give back to our community. Similarly, media monitoring groups have pronounced the elections that they were the most peaceful elections. We also had HHRC, which is our research institution, coming out that the elections were found to actually, in every aspect that was evaluated, to be above, which was excellence, which was above 90%. So that's what really one wanted to share in the given time that we have. There's a long story that one can tell, but I think the simplicity of the message today is that we need to silence the guns of war if we want to see a better world and to be in a position to bring about social justice and fight inequities. The last part that I want also to share is another good story, is that interestingly, I only came into the institution about 2015, but today in South Africa our commission is led, there are 5 commissioners, 3 of those commissioners are women, and the vice is a woman. And then in terms of our provincial, which we have 9 provinces, 9 of those provincial officers, 5 of the provincial officers are women that delivered these elections. And almost 70% of our electoral staff that we train during elections, which is about 250,000, majority of those, it's women and young people. So that's how we are actually making our democracy accessible. That's how we're making our democracy owned by the broader masses in our community, but also those who have been actually put in the margins of our society, in particular our youth and our women. And thank you.
Glenn, thanks. I think it's really useful to have these kind of concrete stories and issues, and I've got a few questions that you opened up from that I'll come back to you on. Thank you for that. Ulrika, over to you, where you have really the floor from which angle you want to take us for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you, and very interesting listening. And I would like to take us back to the Millennium Development Goals planning for the Sustainable Development Goals, because at that time we could really show that, yes, as a world community, we have the possibility to lift people out of poverty, and we continue to do so, and we did even better than we thought we would. Having said that, we knew that we had also a lot of unfinished goals, and we started to plan for the first time for a comprehensive agenda for sustainable development, starting with the goal number 1 to combat poverty and ending with goal 16, well, actually goal 17, which is about the cooperation that we need to have in place in order to do the rest, but goal 16 for peaceful and just societies. Now, since 2015, we see a world with more conflicts, or at least more protracted crisis, with violent extremism on the rise and also increasing crime across the world. And we also see increasing inequality. And I also think when we look at inequality that we need to look at injustice and perceived inequality, because I think that that is what it's very much about. While we did promise to the world community, and not least to the young generation, with the new agenda for sustainable development, that we could actually do much better if we looked to sustainability in the 3 aspects of economic inclusion and sustainability, the whole range of important social factors and social justice that needs to be in place, and also taking into account environment and climate change. We gave that hope and promise, but the perception of so many people, even though we actually see development happening, not across all of the goals, but many of them, is that we are not moving in the right direction, or at least not fast enough. So I think that we really need to understand, and especially looking at the young generation, the importance of the perceived both injustice and also the different dimensions of inequality and how that can be addressed. Because of course this is one of the root causes to what we see with regard to conflicts within societies, in regions and so on. And if we don't address this with the holistic approach of the Agenda 2030, we will not be able to reach these ambitious goals that we have set just 10 years to go. I mean, we are even going in reverse in relation to some of the goals. Climate change, of course, being one of the important topics, very much also relating to inequality, biodiversity, as we know, but also hunger in the world of today. And we also saw now the report of UNHCR coming out that we actually have more people being refugees this year as compared to last year. So UNDP and the United Nations Development System, how do we address this? Well, we were given the mandate to work across so many of these different areas many years back. We were given the mandate to work on combating poverty. But we understood very early that in order to do that, we need to work with what is now Goal 16, strengthening institutions, working with inclusion, doing that with the lens, of course, of gender equality, bringing women to the table, but I think also increasingly now understanding the importance of the young generations, as they are also very important to us, looking at the demography of the world of today, and as was said, also looking at them not as we do sometimes as the problem when we look into conflict, but actually as the ones that can be the agents of change and bringing solutions to the table. We work as the United Nations Development Programme in these areas, and we do that increasingly together with others. I think that the Sustainable Development Goals have become a very important roadmap for us to plan ahead. And what we need to do now is to really work with a broad range of actors and really also believe that there can be local ownership and bringing those best practices on the ground.
Thank you. From local ownership to local communities, which is where Oxfam works a lot in Mexico. Ricardo, give us your impressions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to EPLO for organizing this very important panel. When I was preparing for this panel, I was looking at the title. The title tells a lot. And I think it's very important that when we talk about inequality and peace, we look at power. And I think that's the center, that should be the center of this conversation. Before being the chief executive of Oxfam Mexico, I was the head of research for Oxfam. And as head of research of Oxfam, I worked a lot on the inequality papers that we produce for the World Economic Forum every year. And at the time when Oxfam started work on inequality, there was a very intense internal conversation. Why is this confederation that works on poverty now is looking at inequality? And I think the conclusion that we got after a lot of conversations was because the issues of development have to do with power relations and power systems. And extreme poverty also means not having the capacity to decide on your life, which is, you know, what the Human Development Report, for instance, does, you know, like agency, the capacity to have participation, active citizenship, and things like that. And I think that's where it's really important to link the issue of inequality and peace through power. Now, going to the work that we do in communities and that what we see, once we've identified that the issue of fighting inequality has at the root of it the distribution of power and bargaining power and lack of access to decision making, that's where the programming that we do becomes radically different. It's not about supporting communities, it's about working alongside communities and being of help in their negotiation with the powers that be. Be it for access to resources, and then what we do, for instance, with 16 indigenous communities in the central valleys of Oaxaca, which is one of the poorest states in Mexico. They have this request, this demand to the federal authorities in order to have access to their water. You know, in order to manage the way they handle and they use the water tables, their watersheds. For many years, the Water Commission was not paying attention to these indigenous communities. If you've ever been to Mexico, one of the most unequal countries in the world, in one of the most unequal regions in the world, you'd notice that indigenous communities almost always don't have voice. And that's where, like, the issue of participation comes in. When it's a lot more important than 16 communities instead of one get organized to have this request. And it's also very important that we find the opportunity as Oxfam Mexico to accompany that struggle and to be for them, be with them and work with them whenever they need us. We're not there to tell them what to do. We're not there to actually impose a project on water management. We're there as partners, as political allies, in order to balance that power relation between the federal administration and the 16 indigenous communities, because that's what we need to do. If there's a power gradient that reflects the inequalities in the country, and that's creating conflict, low intensity or high intensity, what we need to do as civil society is rebalance that power and put all our resources and all our commitment to actually open spaces for the voice of this indigenous community. See, we've done that. Sometimes I like to tell this story because, like, sometimes I get a call from the leader of the communities and they ask me, so we need you to come. We need you to come to Oaxaca. We're going to have a conversation with the government and we need you to be here. And it's like, yeah, sure, you know, what do I need to do? It's like, nothing, just bring your Oxfam best. And what? Like, I mean, you have to look angry, you know, and sit next to us. Because that, you know, that presence of an organization that has international connections and that can increase the profile of their struggle is good enough for them sometimes. We don't need to tell them what to do. We don't need to impose projects. What we need to do is make sure that we are there to support the rebalancing of power and that this negotiation, this participation, this decision-making happens on a level playing field. And then change the system, because inequalities exist in a power system. formal and informal power, narratives, policies, institutions. And if we really want to change the way inequalities are being reproduced, what we need to change is the way power is distributed.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's really important to echo that message about how an international organization in a context which may not be their own can use their privilege to open up, to expand, and to even out the table. You all have been absolutely marvelous with your timekeeping, and I hope we can go into a question and answer session. I'm going to use my privilege sitting here to ask a couple of you a few questions while you all warm up, and I figure out how to use this little thing down here, because apparently I'm going to get some questions as well. Christian, you're really at a sort of a unique position from where you see what you oversee. What, in this particular arena where the EU does so much, it has so many tools in the toolbox, where do you see the EU's real added value? And alongside that, what's the EU leverage? What makes the EU so special?
What makes the EU special? Probably that we're an awkward partner. And we like being an awkward partner because we do come with a set of convictions, a set of values and principles that we think are important in terms of underpinning the work we do and underpinning ultimately our societies. And as we reach out, we try to engage on those elements as building stones in whatever actions we are undertaking, whether they are political, socio-economic, or other. That is sometimes interpreted as preaching. Probably it is sometimes. Then we're not doing it very well. But I think if one goes into it with a degree of sensitivity to the particularities of every situation, a degree of modesty as to what has been achieved and what has not been achieved on our home front, but with a conviction that ultimately to take whatever projects we are engaging in, to take them forward, we have to recognize ourselves in them. We're not coming with a preset model. We have at least 28 models in Europe, so we know there is no preset model. But we do come with some elements that we think need to be reflected. And as I said, if we recognize ourselves in that, then we are there as a loyal partner for the long term. Maybe one last word, I don't want to go on too long, but we've heard a lot here about power. Difficult concept to describe exactly, but for me, when we talk about moving towards sustainable peaceful societies. What we're looking for, and that's part, if you like, of our baggage that we bring with us, is power moderated by participation. It is that element of empowerment of people, of bringing them in, of engaging in dialogue, structuring that dialogue, making it part of a societal project, whether it's to resolve technical, social, economic issues, or whether it's to build the future structures of governance. I think working on that empowerment, bringing everyone in, and consolidating structures of governance, which are ultimately about power, but doing that in a way that is controlled and moderated by participation.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, Glenn, in your particular role, you talked a lot about the period, everything that was done before the election in order to enable for safe elections. Another topic I hoped you'd touch on was trying to get people to vote. And so we're talking about young people. Where are there opportunities for innovation? Have you seen anything interesting? What should we be doing more of? And what role does technology play?
Yes, in fact, these last elections, we came up with a number of innovative solutions, among them to try and reach the young people. In particular, we made partnerships with social media groups, Facebook, WhatsApp, and so on, And we were in a position that we could get the messages through those particular channels, because we realized that the patterns of usage of communication, they just differ when you look at the young people's demographics. Instead of the conventional television and radios, you found that they use more the social media, and that's one of the ways we try to reach them. The other, because they are in universities and colleges, we then introduce the mobile units that would then physically go into those areas and communities and do that. But going forward, we're looking at technologies that will enable us that wherever there are large-scale databases, we should be able to transfer them into our data and start working using the online, because that's another thing that we did, to introduce the online for registration. But you have to be registered first to change your details, your addresses. Now what we're looking at is, if you go and look for an ID when you write your matric, or if you're going to university to register, or if you're applying for the first time to get your banking details, we should be able to bring that data into the center so that then the person can then update and give us the most accurate information. So we're looking to technology in helping in that area.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And more on, again, sort of trying to chip away at this in a practical sense. Yasmin, you spoke about the AU Youth Hub and youth participation. Can you expand a little bit more on some good practices, what people should be doing more of, in the inclusion of young people in decision-making? So how did that work there, and decision-making processes really at all levels? Can you give us any highlights?
Of course. And by the way, I've been precisely talking about both the local level and the more institutional level, because my struggle or my commitment is to really bridge the gap between citizens and then the institutions, young people, their needs, and addressing their needs and understanding their needs, and then bringing this recommendation up to the institution, but also the other way around, not only the top-down process, but also the bottom-up level, what the youth can do to foster a more resilient and peaceful society. So my 3 recommendations would be, first of all, we need to invest on youth, as I already said, and then we need to make sure that we change narratives, not only regarding young people, but regarding youth, women, and minorities. We have successful examples of young women from underprivileged backgrounds making change in their societies. We need to show this commitment more, and I would like also to emphasize the role of media in shaping narratives, because the influence media have on elections is something that is very important. So we need to also make sure that the narratives that are diffused correspond to the reality. And thirdly, representation. We need to make sure that these people are effectively represented and heard. And I can give an example on the local level. Even the local authorities struggle to get in touch and to understand the youth. So what can we expect when we don't even reach these young people in the city? What can we expect for their needs to be addressed at the more national level and international level? So we need to, work on ground and then scale up.
Which is exactly what you've been doing. And if anybody doesn't know, she's got like 14,000 Twitter followers, so she's clearly plugged in how to use the media to amplify the voices. And I think you're using what you're doing on the ground and expanding upwards. But we also, in our conversations before, talked quite a bit about access to information. So it isn't just purely traditional kind of education that's going to bring and bridge the gap, but how do people even find out about opportunities? I was asking you, it's not just that you won all of these awards, but how did you even find out they existed?
Definitely. And one of my commitments is also sharing this with the moment you gain a seat or you gain a voice, all you want is sharing these opportunities with other young people. And for me, it's been a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. There are amazing programs funded by the European Union that gives us meaningful opportunities to engage. And we just need to share more this information. So I advise you to continue to follow me. I will share with you all these, because I want more people to engage at an international level and to gain this, opportunity to speak out for their rights.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you both the same question, and then I think I've fully abused my moderator role. It's getting a little hot up here, so I'm about to go out to all of you. One question which was really about the panelists looking at the issue of power. And Christian, you defined it in an even more complex way than I started. So how is it that your organizations, Oxfam's very large in the chapter you run, and UNDP are trying to get a handle on what this really means and what to do about it? Over to you, Ricardo.
That's a great question, and I think, I think we're trying really hard, and it's yet to see if we're succeeding, So I say this with a lot of humility, but I also say it with the conviction that we're committed to rebalance that power. In our strategic plan that you don't need to know, one of our main goals is global balance. And what that means is what we want is a confederation that is more network oriented, where we have civil society organizations local civil society organizations in countries being part of this network. Then Oxfam Mexico is an independent organization. We have a Mexican board, we respond to the Mexican law, we are Mexican, mostly Mexican staff. And the way I describe this is I cannot be expelled from Mexico if I do something with indigenous communities. I can be arrested, but that's different. I have skin in the game. We're part of Mexican society, but we're also part of this wonderful international community. And we put all those things, those assets, at the service of communities. So that's how we're trying. And that's the journey where we're in. Now, there are a lot of challenges because then, we're also a big organization with lots of financing, lots of funding. And in many cases, when we work with local partners say, well, what do you want to be? You want to be a political ally? Do you want to be a broker? Do you want to be a funder? What do you want to be? And in a way, what we're trying really hard to say is we want to be of help. Tell us when you need the finance. Tell us when you need the alliance. Tell us when you need support in any way. But what that means basically is changing the relationship between communities, organizations like Oxfam, and first-level funders. So one thing that we try really hard is not to say, any foundation, I won't say names, any foundation that comes to us and say, well, why don't you finance this program? The first thing we ask is it needed in the communities? Is that what the communities are asking? And then if we actually get some funding, the first thing we do is we go and work with the communities, and we've developed this methodology on rights-based, the gap on rights, and we ask communities sometimes, so what are the rights that are not being met, are being unfulfilled? And then we develop the project based on that. Sometimes the communities come to us and say, what's a right? It's they've been marginalized and ignored for so many years that they have an intuition of what a right is, but they don't necessarily know how to express it. And then we know that we need to work with them on that journey. And it takes longer. It's a different approach. We won't have results in 6 months. We won't have results in 1 year. But when we leave, if we leave, at least we know that there's something more sustainable, that has to do with active citizenship, and it has to do with some sort of internal and external empowerment of the communities.
Thank you for that. If we're going to our hashtag of thinking twice, I think one of the questions is, think twice, is it needed? We're often so pushed politically to do something about a situation that we don't take the time to actually think about whether something should be done or not. And I think to really highlight again, in a world where everything has to be fast and quick and we need solutions, yesterday community change takes time. It takes time, and we need to be able to accompany it. Ulrika, over to you.
So I'll try to be brief, but I think that the United Nations and the United Nations Development Programme, for that matter, I mean, they can be looked, and probably are looked upon in different ways, from different angles. Old institutions, what do they tell us? What can they offer in today's world? I think we need to go back to the Charter and actually remind ourselves that it was about we, the peoples, and then once again actually look at the participatory process that we had ahead of the decision on the Sustainable Development Goals, but open it up even more. And I think that the example that we have on the engagement we see in the Security Resolution 2250, where each and every generation needs also to discover the possibilities of international cooperation and the importance of finding common solutions to common problems, as we see with inequality increasing in all parts of the world, with climate change, stressing this, with the protracted crisis and conflicts and so on. So opening up, as we have done, maintaining the doors open for both civil society, academia, to bring also clever solutions, the private sector and so on, with regard to the financing that needs to be there and part of the solution, but then also remind ourselves that the long-term work that we have been doing, for instance, within UNDP, strengthening the rule of law, working with the institutions and so on, are actually also solutions to these power imbalances that we see across the world. The perception of injustice, of course, is best addressed if people believe that there is rule of law, there is respect for human rights. Even though not perfect, not in any of the member states, but still there to be discussed, judged, people are held to account, and we do see that there are ways of improving this. And that we can also distribute power through well-functioning tax systems. You've seen the Secretary General now saying also how inequality and climate change needs to come together. We shouldn't tax people, but actually tax emissions. So we need also to develop and offer that space for discussions where we can see how we can actually solve the huge challenges of inequality and climate change with solutions coming together. And I think taxation is one interesting thing to look at.
I think having that humbleness and the openness to relook at things and say, we may have agreed and talked for a long time on all of this, but actually we need to look at things a little bit differently. And also, now that you see sort of the global breadth of this panel, perception and who perceives and how they perceive it is so much wider than we originally thought, and perception is reality for people. So I think the issue of injustice and how people are perceiving that will continue to come to the forefront. Let me see who would like to ask questions. I'm going to do sort of block by block. I need you to wave me down, and I would like somebody to come over with a microphone. I just happen to know the first person. I didn't plant you. Would you please introduce yourself very quickly, your name, your affiliation, and your succinct question?
Thank you very much, Sonia. Yes, Debbie Ball from International Alerts. We're a peace-building organisation. A quick comment first, if I may. Thank you for all your presentations, but we should also be conscious of power, resources and participation across the international development sector too. So we should always be conscious of how we can transform ourselves as well. But anyway, my question is around closing civil society space. I'm wondering if the panel have any lessons learned for what might be effective for civil society to respond in such a context where that space is closing, and what lessons you might be able to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks. Great question. I'll take one more in this block. I don't see anyone moving right here, please, in the back.
Thank you, Pilot for Dev, which is a think tank and a network of civil society organizations. I have several questions. The first one is, don't you think that what makes really Europe special, or the European Union special, is still that it's advocating for human rights, climate, all at the same time, and support to civil society? My second question would be, it's good to discuss about fair taxation, but what about international solidarity? And finally, my third question would be, don't you think that peace and stability, which is a bit at the bottom of the list of the SDGs, is the most fragile one, because it can shift really quickly? There are new threats, you mentioned climate, but there are also lots of rapid geopolitical changes and new elements. Thank you.
So there were questions. I got them, and I'll come back. Yeah, no worries. Okay. Anyone from this block? No, moving on to this block right here. Really? All right, over here. Are you stretching? Or are we asking a question?
Just stretching.
Stretching. Okay. So let me go ahead and take those because I think they're really good. The role of civil society space, and if we want to just kind of go down the line, again, that one was really about lessons learned and more from the CSO response. Like, what advice would you give to CSOs about what they can do, maybe to be heard or to deal with that issue? The second question, if I may, were more sort of leading questions, don't you think? So it was another interpretation on what makes the EU special, that it's advocacy for human rights, but more about its values, which I didn't hear you say. Do you agree with that? Not. And I think there was a question which maybe to unpack a little bit the peace and stability side of it. That was much more EU side. So let's go down for CSOs, and I hope you all are warm, so you're warmed up, but I'm going to come back out again. Yasmin.
Yes, I will take this one on civil society organizations, their role, and how to better organize them. And this is why I will advocate for the youth and say that young people, they are, like we are the digital, on the digital era, we're the generation Y. It's very easy for us to connect and to collaborate. And that's what we have been doing, for example, for the adoption of this Youth Peace and Security Resolution. We started by young people coming together and networking and collaborating. The United Network of Young Peace Builders that I've been part of, they've been the leading network for this to happen and to ask for a response unitedly from the youth in different areas of the world to the institutions and to the United Nations. So my advice, one best practice would be really to partner inclusively within the civil society organizations and youth-led organizations. And then I will just, can I take also the one on women in peace processes? Because this is one of the, like, of course, women are often they're the most impacted by conflicts, but we also want to enhance and to break the stereotype that women are only victims. Women are also, like in Libya, they have been leading the movement for the revolution. In Sudan, they are leading the movement for revolution. Women are part of the movements during the change of politics, but then on the peace processes, they're completely absent because they're taken off from that table. And so this needs to change. We need to change our perception of what role women have in our society. This has to do with gender roles. But of course, they're the most impacted on conflict. That's why they're even more, legitimate to speak.
Thank you. Glenn, over to you. You have a civil society background, so I'm sure you can infiltrate us with lots of advice.
Yes, I think in our experience, especially with elections, the bedrock of our broad-based involvement is actually empowering the civil society. But what's important here is that you should never treat the civil society as homogeneous. You need to break them down into the demographics that are manageable and are relevant to the conditions and the environment that you are in. If you talk young people, they are not homogeneous. If you talk women, they're not homogeneous. If you're talking migrants, they are not homogeneous. But at the same time, they have common issues and common interests. So it's important to really drill down into the specifics of saying these are the best approaches in actually bringing those people and so they feel they've been included, while you also make sure that you unlock the resources that then can be utilized in furthering the advocacy and the issues that they want to see manifest in your program. If you come from a top-down, you are bound actually to lose. And I mean, one of the things that while we have had these peaceful elections at the political party level, we had social unrests that were based on issues that were community-based issues such as access to water, access to government services, and so on and so forth. In fact, the highest civil unrest leading to elections were in these last elections. And despite us having conflict resolution, having trained 1,000 people drawn from the civil society, but the issues that were in the community were slightly different, that they came out from different community groups saying, we are mobilizing, we're not getting good services in our area. We want housing, we want to access to water, we don't want the shacks in the area that you are in. So it's a continuous, you have to be vigilant as well. It's a continuous shift of issues in your society. As long as you're sensitive and you're alert to those things, then you can keep moving with them. I don't think I would like to say it's something that you can completely eliminate, because we are a very robust society. Issues are evolving all the time, and people will continue to advocate for them. We should embrace that as institutions and be in a way to say, how then do we work with those communities?
I'm going to let you reflect on the last one, which is particularly in the closing of space, because a lot of the settings that we're seeing is when people are going out in the street, it's actually having the reverse effect. So instead of making more room and more space, it's scaring people and they're shutting it down. So hopefully you can, I'll come back to you a little bit on that in the next round about what else can civil society do, yes, to be productive, to get the voice heard, but to deal with this issue of being sort of put back in a box. I'll come back. Issue of civil society, maybe also how the EU is working with civil society and the importance of making sure that the actions addressing economic and peace are really right at the center of people, are gender sensitive, but what advice do you have on that closing of space, but also really on the EU working with civil society?
Okay.
And I do know you have to run.
It's still working.
You're on.
I'm on?
Nope.
Okay, very briefly on the points made.
Sorry, no mic.
No.
No.
I don't know who to wave
Now?
at.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Hang on, warm up. There. All right. Just very quickly first, I thought I did mention values, including human rights, in my introduction. I certainly spoke of values and principles as part of the baggage we bring with us, and a very essential part of that is our belief in fundamental human rights. Indeed, that's one of the points of awkwardness that we often have with our interlocutors at the official level in other countries. There are many who say, let us take care of security and stability, and then you help us get on with development. I always get very suspicious when governments want to talk to me about stability. Of course, that's important, but it lacks that participation side. And my answer to them is that governments that are afraid of listening to their own people won't last very long. It makes for fragile societies. Working in reverse order, SDG 16 as being the most fragile and the last one. It might have been the last one added. It's certainly not the most fragile. It's the fairly obvious conclusion that, without security, you won't have development, and without development, you won't get sustainable security and stability. So we need to work on them together. That's what we try to do. Now, civil society and the civil society space. We systematically try to engage with civil society within Europe in various consultative forums, and with our partners, including a civil society dimension in most of our policy dialogues, whether they are general policy or development policy or human rights issues, whatever it is, to make sure that we have civil society fora where we bring them in. That is often difficult. It doesn't always meet with huge enthusiasm. In some countries, to their credit, it does. The issues of shrinking civil society space is a huge matter of concern, one which we try to address politically, but also, if you like, legally, by trying to work on the governance structures and saying there must be a place for that. That's why I come back to the importance of governments listening to their own people. If you allow, I know that it's easy to say when we sit comfortably in Brussels, but what advice to civil society when they're facing a shrinking space? Make noise, speak up, find ways of making your voice heard, reach out, including through new and different channels if necessary. And if you allow, I'll end with a quote which I found in Mexico in a student debate on the freedom of speech and the challenges with threats to journalists and others there. Well, there was one who said, ¿Por qué callarme cuando nací gritando? Why should I shut up when I was born shouting?
Thank you. And on that note, you're leaving us. Thank you, Christian.
Apologies for leaving.
Don't anybody go anywhere.
Yes.
Do you want to bump over? Or are you okay there?
I think we're okay.
Okay. Ricardo, over to you. We're on the question of closing of civil society space. And let's see what you're learning from your work there and elsewhere at Oxfam.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge. There are learnings, but I think the question is where those learnings are sustainable in many different ways. You know, part of those learnings include sharing information across organizations and across countries, because in many ways the tactics and the strategies that governments less inclined to freedom of speech and civil society, they share those tactics between them. You know, they even share kind of legislation or principles of legislation, and I think it's very important that civil society actually does something similar. You know, they start sharing information on how to avoid the crackdown. I think connecting the dots between civil society and journalism, for instance. Mexico, for instance, is one of the most violent countries for journalists. And in many ways, the accountability work that civil society and journalism do is very similar, but we don't connect the dots. So then connecting the dots is also very important. And the other thing is, I think, influencing funders, because in many ways, foundations and donors, they see civil society in many ways as channels of disbursement and not as allies. And I think, you know, and that means very technical issues, you know, cost recovery a very low cost recovery that doesn't allow to do more political work or do more influencing work. And some organizations are changing that. And say in the US, the Ford Foundation is now increasing their cost recovery to 20%, which is, you know, compared to other donors is a lot more. And they do it based on a strategy to support civil society. And I think that's very important. Influencing donors is very important. And also, so we were discussing this, you know, like, I mean, I think the EU is a great partner for civil society, but I think they need to look at civil society more as an ally and be true to those principles and be true to the principles of inclusion and having these conversations not in a top-down level but in a horizontal level. And I think like having the capacity and the organizational news to actually do that is very important, and very quickly it links to the question on international solidarity, because once you connect groups across countries, the voice is stronger. We've seen in many cases in Latin America, again, governments that are not inclined to freedom of speech, many times they don't listen to local civil society organizations, but they do listen when either the Financial Times or the New York Times or there is a statement in the General Assembly or, you know, anything international, then they pay attention. And I think that's one of the strengths that as civil society we need to build, you know, that international solidarity, because it gives us leverage. It gives us leverage to local change.
Very good. Thank you. Ulrika.
So in this high-level political forum in July in New York, we will take stock on the development of the SDG 16, the hardest goal to get, but yet so important, as many of us have said. And once again, remembering that we did invite not only the heads of states and the governments, but actually the broad range of actors in order to be able to reach those goals. So, I mean, I would very much also invite those of you who work with civil society to take the stage and open those doors and enter the UN when we have our different possibilities to discuss important topics. Because certainly, and also perhaps alluding to when you said that there is not one civil society, we can see that there are a lot of interests actually wanting to push back with regard to rights-based agenda. We saw that happening during the CSW this year, where there were very, very high, strong voices pushing back on women's rights. So we also need voices also upholding, as we know, many of the agreements that we have been able to reach in the international community through the work within the UN, and safeguard what we have, and hopefully also with the presentations that we will have from countries this year also bring some best practices. Because even though I believe, and I have 20 years of background in civil society myself, I mean, that we need to have that critical civil society, it's of course also very strategic and smart to work on best practices. Where can we see countries actually moving forward in all different aspects of sustainability, bringing more economic prosperity, social inclusion, peaceful society, also with a broad participation from civil society? And how can we encourage other countries that do introduce these kind of legislations where you actually hinder participation of civil society in the name of security agendas and so on, to open up and to see that there is possibility that a lot of the solutions that we will need to come not only from governments but all parts of society. And I hope to see also some really good and interesting examples when countries report, and that we can build on those examples during the high-level political forum.
Thank you. We just have a few more minutes in terms of question and answer. I want to see if there's a couple more burning questions right here in the middle section here. And if you could be as short as possible to give our participants the opportunity to answer.
Thank you very much. I'm Isabella Toth. I work for CoreAid in the Netherlands, and our credo is working in and on fragility. So thank you to the panelists for all the inputs. I have a question, two questions. One is about the shrinking space. Nowadays, I start to frame it due to some other things, the rise of authoritarian governments. I think that some of you have mentioned in extremely diplomatic terms how the chess pieces are around on the international scene, and that has an influence on, and it encourages often governments to become repressive, even in Europe. So that's one. How do you see that? How do you see, for instance, and the other issue is that in the international aid architecture has invited, and thank God for that, that's correct, the private sector and an actor in development as well, which means also that if somebody is in, then somebody has less space. Not because of that simply, but because of the fact that for many stakeholders, the value added of another actor would seem or be perceived as more of a value. And last but not least, we are talking about fragility and peace and security. What is your opinion of the following thing? Many of the actors in domestic stakeholders give more legitimacy to non-traditional, non-governmental actors. Think of the Shuras in Afghanistan or something like that. What does that do to the legitimacy of a central state when we think of the global effective development cooperation agenda with Paris, Accra, Busan and all that thing? What does it do with our efforts as international actors in those countries? And that's it. Then I would have some more.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is I'm going to give you all about a minute to respond to which aspect of that you want to. Any last comments? And I'd like to do a really fast summary in order to get out of here for the next panel that'll come in. I'm going to go this way around. Ulrika, please.
Yeah, so perhaps to mention something about the legitimacy of the state, I think that we will also see, and we should look closer to different experiences at local and regional level, because we see now increasingly, also from the UN perspective, that there are a lot of cities and regions that also pick up the Agenda 2030 as a framework, and that it works quite well also in countries where we don't see the same kind of engagement, perhaps at the national level. So I think that that can also, to give us that hope and aspiration that we need in order to bring more people along and look for those solutions can be something to look at. And of course, I mean, if you look at the conflict arena, it's really, really difficult nowadays, not only with the protracted and regional conflicts, but also with the different actors, both locally and so many of the conflicts being proxy conflicts. So it's a very complicated world we have. Yeah.
Thank you. Ricardo, your last words.
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what Ulrika was saying about the legitimacy of the state, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing nowadays in all kinds of countries, high income, middle income, low income, and it's paired with the legitimacy of different groups in society that don't have necessarily a formal role. And I think that, like, I mean, that's one of the reasons why inequality is so important, because the legitimacy of the economic system, of the political system, of the social system is linked to those results in which the benefits of a growing economy are being concentrated on very few people, and the rest are being left behind. And I think that's where we can connect the dots, and the only way in which we can reshape the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of the economic system, the political system, the social system, is by changing the results. And by changing the results, we need organization, and we need strong civil society, and we need to reclaim the shape of all that system to actually achieve those results. It's a lot of work. It's very challenging, but it's been done in the past. In the past, we built, like some countries better than others, but like we built societies that are more inclusive. And I think that's a goal that we need to set ourselves for 2030 and beyond.
Thank you. Glenn?
From my perspective, really, it boils down to that reactionary forces can only breed more when those who are progressive are silent or passive. Secondly, when we don't mobilize the up-and-coming generation. So in science, is that nature does not leave a vacuum. So if we leave the young people ill-equipped or not understanding the evolution that has brought us where we are today, and any other forces and interests that have totalitarian dictatorships who will thrive. It doesn't matter from which ideological leaning they come from. It's because we would not have actually entrenched and deepened the understanding of constitutional democracy. And to me, it is about mass mobilization in every corner of the society, that people they feel that it is part of their values. They stand and they will defend the Constitution and all what it then espouses. The human rights, I mean, in our Constitution, we open that to say that the country belongs to all who live in it, and with our diversity. We acknowledge this diversity, but we're all saying we stand for one thing, that is a constitutional democracy. So to me, the best way to deal with some of these challenges is we need to make sure everybody is mobilized from childhood until to your grave. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and we're almost out of time. I'm getting flashed with various signs in the back. Last word, like
Yes.
really, yeah, what do you want to leave us with?
I will just end in replying to our friend who spoke about the danger of conservative discourses and hate speech discourses in our European countries. I was in Berlin a few days ago, and I said this. 60 years ago, our forefathers and foremothers came together to say never again. And so today I stand up and ask you to stand up and say never again. We should say never again. And we should make sure that this message passes to everybody, young people, older people, break these fears and make sure that our rights and our European Union, which is a project of peace, that ensures human rights and democracy, we need to treasure our values. Because in other countries, and I can tell it through my colleagues here, they wish they had the values we have, so we need to cherish them. And I will hand like this.
Thank you, well done.
Thank you.
Let me just share a few key takeaways, which is a challenging aspect of this, but some things that I hope that we can remember and take forward that the panelists said today. We were talking about inclusion, and it's not just social and economic, but political inclusion is just as important. The need to view women not only as victims, but as agents for change, that's critical. We talked a lot about why are people radicalized, looking at power, participation, and resources. We look to solutions for countering violent extremism. Let's look at what really those root causes are. We talked a little bit also about engagement and engagement of young people, not just being about formal education, but it's also about ways in which people have access to opportunities and access to information as well. Technology is a solution, it's not always a problem, and looking for more and more ways in which we can get people engaged through that. And the CSOs are not homogeneous. Civil society looks different in different places. The possibility that it is still our duty and our goal to lift people out of poverty, and that on this breadth and panorama that we've traveled today, we can't lose sight of injustice and the perception of injustice. And that it's about working alongside communities. So maybe the element of support needs to be dropped a little bit further down, and that by working together, we can use the privilege from the outside to expand the table and to even out the table. I would like to thank each and every one of you for your participation today. Everybody out in the audience, please join me in thanking our panelists.